Hi, this is Paul, and this is probably the first sort of normal video I've made for what feels like a very long time. I just haven't had the opportunity to do it. It doesn't take a lot of time to make these videos, but it does take free time in a sense, time that I don't have to devote to my family or my job or the other things that pull on me. But it's got a little bit of free time at the end of this week, and so I'll have something for Monday morning, and that'll be good. For those of you watching, no Sunday school this summer, so we won't have those Sunday school lessons this summer. I'm just in and out of town too often, and someone broke in and stole the television that was in that room. So Rick had given us an old TV that he had. He had replaced his TV, and so someone stole Rick's TV and Maury's lawnmower while I was gone. Things always happen when I'm not here. So that's sort of normal at Living Stones. There's a lot of really interesting conversations out there right now. Karen Wong has had Michael Levin on a couple of times. Karen Wong also had that Wolfgang Smith interview. So she had Michael Levin on and John Vervaeke. That was an outstanding conversation. The Montreal conversation with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau. I'm going to play some of that in this video. Obviously, I've been thinking a lot about Synod. Bernardo, there's talk maybe in the Dutch tour visiting with Bernardo Kastrup. I don't know if that'll happen or not. We'll see. So there's a lot going on. I still have a lot of work to do on the European side of the trip. But at Synod, I was doing a lot of thinking about this conversation that we're having, that Pageau and Vervaeke and Jordan Hall, I just am 2/3 of the way through that video, and there's tons of stuff in that video I want to talk about. So there's just so much content there that not only do I not have time to make videos, I'm trying to find enough time to even listen to videos from which to make videos. So, and I think production this summer is just going to be haphazard. In a few weeks, I'll be leaving on vacation for a few weeks. And so I don't know if I'll be making videos or not. My wife says, "Oh, you should do these tiny little videos on your cell phone and upload them." So we'll see if I do those. But anyway, I was thinking a lot during Synod about this whole conversation, especially with respect to nomenclature and language. And so the Symbolic World has two excellent essays by Daniel Townhead and Kenneth Florence. This was Symbolic World versus Egregores Part 2. And I like the way that they tried to work through these issues, and we have all of this Jonathan Pageau stuff, and I really appreciated these essays, how they're just sort of carefully looking at the language, looking at how we're being used, try to make sense of it. And I thought the essays were very helpful, and I'll put links to them down below. So I thought about it a lot when I was in Synod, thinking about the body. Obviously, this comes out of the church, the body of Christ. We're thinking about bodies. You think about Synod as a body. Part of the way Synod works in the Christian Reformed Church is that each Synod is, in a sense, a different body. Synod doesn't meet all year round. There's an executive team that is, in a sense, in session all year round. There's a council of delegates that acts on behalf of Synod between synodical meetings, but Synod itself is a body. And so all of these thoughts that we've had about consciousness and bodies, they've all sort of come together. Now, I think again here, John Vervaeke comes in with some really helpful nomenclature. I think Jonathan and I don't have a problem with the church's traditional language, but part of the difficulty with this, Nathan from the UK is always complaining about dialogos. Why don't you just say dialogue? And so I finally wrote him a note on one of the comments that when we're using these terms that are sort of specialized, these fancy Vervaeke words, because we've defined them, they have a sharper, more precise definition. And so when we choose to use sort of the fancy word instead of the more common word, we do so because we've got some agreement, and we've got some recording about exactly what we're talking about. Dialogue can mean a whole range of things. Dialogos we're using for something in particular. Now, John's got some new language on this.
I tend to prefer the term hyperagent, which is analogous to Morton's idea of hyperobjects. And so it already has a good provenance, and it captures.
And I like hyperagent and thinking about synod as, well, there's a spirit of synod, and this particular synod surely had a spirit. And in some ways, yeah, I'll still have to continue to work through this language.
The discourse around the agency of the collective intelligence found within distributed cognition. Those are the three terms I would like to put at the front.
So in some ways, synod has a distributed cognition, and synod exists as a body, and synod exists as a body within a far larger body called the Christian Reformed Church. Now, actually, in a different conversation I was having on my trip, someone mentioned a dysfunctional family. And, I've heard this term all the time and sort of understood what it meant. But given the fact that I was thinking a lot about extended bodies or higher beings, now we've got hyper agency, which is an interesting term. That term will have to grow on me. I was thinking about what a dysfunctional family is. Well, why is a family dysfunctional? Now, a family is not simply one member of the family dominating over all the other members of the family. That's not a family. A family is a deeply interconnected body, as it were, and that body has a degree of agency, and it needs to attend to a whole variety of things. Part of what a body should do is, let's say, grow up the children well, and the actions of the body upon the children will form these children for better or for worse, or sometimes both. Now, the context of this conversation was someone talking about a dysfunctional family that, in that case, they weren't talking about parents over minor children. They were talking about a group of adults discussing what they should do in terms of a decision that they really had to make collectively. You often have this, let's say, when you have a parent who is getting up in years, perhaps losing their agency, and so the body has to come together and make a decision together, let's say, about a member of the body. Let's say an aging parent, or let's say a disabled person within the family. Now, a functional family should be able to have a conversation and achieve an outcome, a unified outcome that everyone in the family can, at least to one degree or another, agree upon. Okay? And in that way, we see the agency of the family, and we, in a sense, see the body of the family, the spirit of the family, the hyper agency of the family, pursuing a particular outcome. I'm just trying to make pursuing a particular outcome so that something can be achieved. And you very much see, let's say, outcome X, something like that. You very much see, well, that's what the family should do. Now, when I think about, let's say, synod, well, bother. When you have a synod, the synod has to, in some ways, be a large body and act as a large body. And of course, it's quite a bit more complicated than a family. Family units are usually smaller by virtue of shared genetics, shared upbringing. Ideally, families can come to consensus about things. Now, what happens with the Synod as a body is that you have all sorts of rules and procedures and ways of deciding and enabling that Synod to act. And again, just as the family should act towards the telos or direction of something, the Synod should act towards the telos or direction of another thing. Now, maybe I'll just jump into commentary mode here and let these guys talk a little bit more.
Hyperagency, collective intelligence, distributed cognition, and put them within a framework that is not just bottom up, but also equally top down. So that's my first proposal.
Now, part of not just bottom, and this is, it's really amazing how this conversation is developing. You can go back and watch the earlier videos. We sort of started out the conversation where John was really emphasizing bottom up. And you've really seen the transformation in John where he's and this is exactly how it should be. This is not a criticism. I think I've tried to be transparent in the ways that I have evolved and been changed by John and by Jonathan. And so we really see John and his Neoplatonism and trying to figure out the bottom up and the top down and getting that balance right. And this conversation really has a lot in it with respect to those kinds of things. Now, this is another video I have to watch because this one was footnoted in the egregore conversation. Egregores are sort of only bottom up and headless in a way. And they talked about that in this video. Whereas what we hope to see from a Synod, and in fact, this is built into the Synod all the way through in terms of the prayer, the attention. Again and again, Synod is asking that God, in a top-down sort of way, will move the Synod to be in accordance with his desire for the community and for the world. And there's ritual with respect to that. There are prayers with respect to that. It's a very messy situation because there continues to be deliberation and differences of opinion. And in some ways, a Synod is set up to be sort of adversarial, but you very much have the bottom up and the top down in action in an event like that.
My sense is I'm coming at it almost in the direction of a blind man feeling the landscape and trying to notice what the different things are in the landscape. And I'm not quite sure what's there. And it seems like there's probably a number of distinct kinds of things that are not all the same. But it might be useful to discern the distinctions and some sense of, like, what would you call it? Not the bestiary. What's a collection of beings called? Definitely don't want to call it a pantheon, but you know what I'm saying. A collection.
A bestiary or a taxonomy.
Yeah.
Taxonomy, yeah. Be serious.
Well, a taxonomy would be, yeah, I'm not sure that's the right word. But again, you have to understand that in these conversations, you're all working on the fly. And I have them all at a disadvantage because I get to sit here and pause and think and reflect and watch it multiple times. But that's just the nature of what we're doing with this.
And so I think that the way that because I've been thinking a lot about this egregore, and also I've been provoked and kind of challenged by the people that follow what I'm doing and are thinking in similar terms as I am. And one of the things that they've noticed is that there are certain, let's say there are collective beings or like hyper agents, the way that John talks about, that seem to have more logos, that seem to be teleologically structured. Let's say the navigation of a ship, for example. So the navigation of
and again, Synod desires to have, the word and the logos, and of course Synod is Synod has all of this stuff operating around it. There's the Bible, there's confessions, there's tradition, there's culture, there's personal history. It's that makes it. Some of this comes from the bottom, obviously theologically. Some of this comes from the top.
Of a ship will have a clear hierarchy, and there'll be a captain who will, let's say, be the top of the way that the direction that it's going. He's going to manage the others, but they're all working together and paying attention to the same telos, and so they're able to function as a body, But there are also
and in Synod there's a president and officers and committees. Part of I thought about this a lot during Synod, because part of what Synod does is that you have advisory committees, and the advisory committees are made of like 20 or so people. And so for the first 2 days, you meet together with your advisory committee with a limited element of the agenda. The agenda is all split up amongst those advisory committees, and then those advisory committees give advice to Synod, and actually the specific recommendations for Synod come from those advisory committees. And so that's sort of like the precognition for Synod. And in this particular Synod, almost everything that was given to Synod passed. And it's just thinking about it from below here, you sort of get a nice sample. Everybody gets to spend more time working on it. They can sort of refine the language. And so the overall spirit of Synod sort of gets distilled into those advisory committees, and they then produce the elements.
Versions of these beings that seem to be something like headless. And this is what some of my friends have pointed out to me, and that they seem to be more, they seem to pop up and disappear. And so you see that the type of being that Jordan was talking about in his discussion about these weird morality codes that rise up online and then start to manage the way that people act. They seem to be these headless beings, but they act upon the group. They have causative power. And so they look like, that's why there's something of a monstrous effect. And that's why these people, I'm going to have a conversation with them as well.
And I think, part of the headlessness is evidenced in their inability to stay. They're disorganized. They can't sustain themselves. And now John's going to get in with his autopoiesis, which I thought was a really helpful comment.
I'll read soon, but why they said maybe the term egregore is good for these types of manifestations, which are these, like a mob, for example, that is swerving, and then people pop up. Like if you look at Tiananmen Square, is a great example of this when it was happening. You had this mob of people, and then all of a sudden a leader would pop up, and then people kind of start to follow that leader for like an hour.
And you could see this in an advisory committee, for example. Let's say the 20 people are working on something, and everybody is, let's say, trying to solve a problem in their advisory committee, and a solution seems to present itself that, at least for a little bit, seems to collect the people, and everybody goes over there, and then they discover, oh, this isn't a solution, and then it backs down. It's almost like something sort of develops, and then it backs down. Something sort of develops, and then it backs down.
And then someone else would scream somewhere else, and then people would just like be moving from head to head, and they couldn't find clear direction. And really is like this. So it does have a kind of agency, but I mean, you would say something like a demonic agency. It doesn't have a clear telos, let's say.
Well, that's where I'd want to challenge it. I think I like the distinction, and I now see how I would respond. I'd say if you want to reserve egregore to those things, those processes that are self-organizing, but are not autopoietic, then that is exactly where the boundary of agency is lost. Mm-hmm. The tornado is self-organizing, and that to me is what's happening in Tiananmen Square. You're having a social tornado, but it is not autopoietic in that it does not self-organize in order to seek out the conditions that produce, promote, and protect its own existence. Whereas I take it that hyper-agencies do. So an example of a hyper-agency that clearly does this is a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies, in fact, often become totally just self-perpetuating entities that have been self-organize for this telos, but the autopoietic element takes over and sometimes to horrific degrees. That's in Kafka, right? And
Yeah.
so, right. So I'm now seeing a continuum. But to me, the line where we ascribe agency is precisely the line of where the self-organization has passed properly into being autopoietic. And when there is no evidence for autopoiesis, we should not ascribe agency. And when what we can ascribe very sophisticated self-organization. And if that's what people want to point to with the term egregore, then I think it's a good term for that phenomena. And I'm willing to accept that correction. But for me, I'm interested in the capacity for reality to produce hyper agents because they, to me, have a significance for our understanding. We have
now. It seems to me that, let's say, in a body like Synod or an advisory committee, there is a search for there is sort of a collective cognition that is happening, but it is seeking another level of sustainability. And that's that it seems to be that autopoiesis that John is talking about, that it's seeking something that will be sustained and will in fact sustain the community going forward. These are, in some senses, the advisory reports are sort of the elements of the distributed cognition that come out of the advisory reports and then go into the full synod and then will be processed by the larger. And then in terms of the larger body, that is the Christian Reformed Church, videos, recordings of it go out, commentaries go out by me, and a few others are doing commentaries now in a little different way. And then the Acts of Synod will go out, and then that will sort of be distributed out into the Christian Reformed Church and sort of goes out into the wild. And then over the course of a year, you'll see how that new posture of the body impacts the environment in which the body is. And then a new synod will convene a year from now, and there'll be overtures that come in, there'll be communications that come in. All of the synodical delegates will have had experience with how the actions of Synod 2022 have changed the church, and then they'll come back, and it's a very dynamic system.
Always understood our agency in relationship to some kind of hyper agency. To me, I think that's part of your point, Jonathan, right? Human beings have always understood ourselves in terms of hyper agents. And so I think the current discovery of hyper agency has a spiritual potential and significance that the discovery of just of social self-organization does not have.
Okay, let me throw something in that just came up, and I'm not sure this is a good idea, but it occurs to me that to the degree to which this conversation has a capacity to be an embodiment or a manifestation of one of these kinds of beings,
yes,
that would be the self-referentially proper way to guide its directionality.
Yes.
In some sense, what being is endeavoring to express itself to these particular humans, so we can take it as a applied experiment.
Excellent.
Something that I noticed that this particular one seems to have as a orientation is precision. And as you were talking about the distinction between a tornado and, let's say, something else, I wanted to get very, very close, because that line is actually a very subtle line.
Yes.
If I zoom in at the edge of a tornado, there actually is a shift in the probability of Brownian motion at the event horizon.
To sort of equally attribute cognition, and some use that term now to refer to these. I think the question is directed towards me. For me,
Jonathan says here he has a hard time understanding Jordan Hall. I do too. There are times when Jordan Hall talks and it's like, I don't know what you're saying. So, but I've had the same experience with John and Jonathan too. So it's, it's not a criticism. It's just trying to understand. But in the context of this video, I don't have much commentary to offer because I didn't understand. Now, in this conversation, John Vervaeke is supposed to sort of be the Jordan Hall whisperer and be able to explain what Jordan is saying when he says these things.
The autocatalytic, and this is, of course, what Kaufman says, it might be necessary, but it's not sufficient for life. was because an autocatalytic process, right, is in some sense perpetuating itself, but it is nevertheless not seeking out the conditions that have to obtain. And so my evidence for that is tornadoes will move onto terrain that immediately destroys them. And as Jonathan was saying, the self-organization is starting to coalesce into, something that might do something around this leader, and then it shifts to this leader, and then it shifts to this leader, right?
And I'd want to nuance some of these, because I think basically what heresy is in that sense, it's a headless egregore type dynamic where just as tornadoes move themselves onto terrain that destroys them, heresy is in a sense churches moving themselves onto terrain that destroys it.
Right. And so there is no, well, to my mind, there is not enough top down. And that's why I wanted to emphasize in the egregore. I'll use that term now to refer to these social self-organizations, if that's okay. There's not enough top down to attribute cognition.
And so in many ways what a synod does, and hence the prayers, hence the study, hence the dialogos, hence all of the conversation, it in effect wants to make itself open and pursue the top down, because there's the belief that in fact their future lies in the top down, and they want to be less like a tornado and more like following the path of that which is coming down to them from above.
Because I take it that what we're trying to talk about when we're talking about things like, when we are invoking terms like spirit, or what I try to invoke like hyper agent, is we have something that has a capacity to not just self-perpetuate, but to self-promote and self-protect. And that in that sense, we want to sort of equally attribute cognition and something like a life to it.
And I think that's exactly right. I found this, again, I'm not finished with this conversation, but what I heard was very compelling. One of the interesting, difficult things to do is define life, but almost through this way, I think we're getting a sense of what we mean by life. And obviously, in Christian theological terms, life comes down from us from above, and death is our rebellion against the life. You hear this in a lot of the orthodox ways of talking about life, and basically putting oneself in the life. And I think I think about C.S. Lewis's book Miracles a lot, and when I think about this conversation, I think about Lewis's miracles of the new creation, and I think about the miracles of Jesus, because one of the interesting things about the miracles of Jesus is obviously someone who all of us can destroy life. Jesus seems to make life. Jesus makes the blind to see, the deaf to hear, and the lame to walk, and he raises people from the dead. He'll still a destructive storm. Now, all of this, I think, is indicating his relationship with life. In other words, Jesus' miracles aren't simply just little tricks, but they are in the direction of life.
Okay, so me, the other thing I'd like to bring into this, what you're saying, John, is what would be the difference between, let's say, so we have the notion of a being that is properly organized towards the telos and structures itself hierarchically in a way that seems to give it agency, right? So then we have these momentary beings that kind of shift from one way to the other and don't seem to be able to do that. And then you have something, what I would call something like parasitic processes.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Right. So let's say I see that more easily within, let's say the mob. So the mob is a good example, like at a social level. And an addiction would be a good example at a personal level, where you have a process that is.
And this, I really love this example, because, again, the mob, it's at a social level, and you can sort of see the one level up that the mob has. But yet you also see the relationships between the levels. And I love this. I love this illustration.
Self-perpetuating, that has all the mechanisms to preserve itself, but then can ultimately be the demise of the structure that holds it together, can ultimately kind of break, can kill you. Like, so you can have an addictive pattern within you that is doing all.
And you have the sense that the mob, the life of the mob is finally self-defeating. Once you get in, you can't get out. It's imprisonment. It traps you. It will itself kill you, and everybody knows that.
All these things, but then it ultimately could act against the body that's holding it together.
It's funny, as you were saying that, I immediately thought of parasitic processing. So I think I'm right. I'm really catching your perspective, I hope. Yeah, I think the idea of something like a self-organizing process that is parasitic but is nevertheless self-destructive of what we might call its substrate. I'm trying to use terms very neutrally here. I think that's right. But since I coined the term with Leo, I guess I can speak to its provenance. The intent of parasitic processing is it's actually something that is destroying agency. That's one of its defining features.
And I love the way agency has become a really helpful term. It's also a fairly public term. But again, when you read C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, when I was in Western Michigan, the Western Michigan estuary, someone actually had me sign a copy of C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. It's like, I really have to write my own book, so I signed. People always give me Jordan's books to sign, and here's a Lewis book to sign. I don't sign C.S. Lewis or Jordan Peterson. I just sign my own name. But you have the sense of what Jesus has is this agency. And again, if you read Dominion, you get to see his agency through time. You get to see his agency displayed in the world. This is part of what Lewis says at the beginning of Miracles, when he notes that in many religions and many ancient stories talk about miracles, but in almost all of those, the miracles are disposable in terms of the heart of the message of the religion. But Lewis says, and I think the engagement of Christianity with modernity has borne this out, if you dispense of the miracles, something in Christianity gets lost. Because the center of Christianity is, in fact, the grand miracle, which Lewis then is one of the central chapters in that book. Because, and I think the reason is because part of what Christianity is the agency. Now, this comes through in the book of Acts. I'll be in the book of Acts. The way it's, so there's a lectionary throughout the calendar. So we have Lent and Advent and Epiphany and some of those. And so I'm keeping some of those months in the Christian calendar now. But when we're in ordinary time, I've sort of been working my way through the Bible, but I've never done an extended treatment on Paul of Tarsus. So I'm using Acts as sort of a framework by which I can get into some of these other letters. And so this week we've got Paul. He left Corinth. He went to Ephesus just for a short time, and down Ephesus to Jerusalem to fulfill a vow, and then up to Antioch, and then out again on his third missionary journey. But where was I going with respect to agency with this? But Jesus, you have boldness and power, and what you see in Christians given them by the Holy Spirit through the church is agency. It's life, and in many ways that ought to be the mark of the Spirit's presence in our lives.
It insinuates itself into the agency of, well, in the case we were originally talking about, of an individual cognizer, takes on a life of its own, but at the expense of the agency that it is dependent upon. And so for me, that's I think what that calls for then, I feel what's happening is we're being called to like a continuum in the taxonomy. We've got egregores, and then we have hyperagents, and now there's this in between thing. Yeah, to me, it doesn't cross the line, the threshold into hyperagency, because it's like an addiction. It's ultimately it's a twist in the potential for agency that is being actualized as the self-destruction of agency, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I'm trying to bring that up is just because I'm also trying to account for the iconography, let's say. That is one of the reasons why demons are represented the way they are. Like if you look at the way demons are represented, they're always represented as hybrid monsters. That is, they're represented in a way that they have no definite identity, but they can nonetheless act on you. And they act on you in a manner that wants to, like you said, John, to destroy your agency, to destroy your being, basically. They want, the demons ultimately want to feed off of you until you die. And so they're actually represented visually, if you look at the way they're represented in medieval art, in a way that seems to represent this problem that we're talking about. So they're egregores in a way, because they're like this mismatch of beings. You know, they're like a fish mixed with a human, mixed with, you know, with the tail and all these weird things. But then it also is able to act upon you, and in a way that's violent, right? They're sticking forks into you. They're basically torturing you ultimately.
I like where this is going. I like how we're getting this articulation of the continuum that is trying to be birthed in the taxonomy. I like this a lot.
So let me throw some more parameters, or what you call that? So like edges, shape. And
I think when it comes to Synod, what Synod is seeking is, again, where they're going to go with the demonic is you know, into some very old commentary and theology about the relationship, the parasitic relationship that evil has with good.
Is something like closure, thermodynamics, closed system, disconnection, separation. Okay. And in particular, something like the metaphor of death. So if I consider, for example, an animate body, let's just go with a rabbit that's hopping about as a being, and then it's a dead rabbit, right? Something has happened, a discontinuity has occurred. The physical body and the components that made up that physical body are now subject to a completely different regime of dynamics, right? They've now become thermodynamic in characteristic. In fact, a more fundamental notion, I think, of parasitic process, which is there's a gradient of possibility or a stored capacity that has been built up by the organic being, which is now a feedstock for a completely different set of regimes that are, in fact, in relationship with the rabbit, are in fact bottoms up, right? They're bacteria and predators and parasites and whatnot that are going to decompose that stored energy, which is living precisely in the gap between what was at one point a autopoietic process and is now transitioned. Okay, that's one. Two, how would we say, the confusion that arises when something of that sort, let's just go with the bunny that died for a moment, happens to be made up of human beings. The difference between a tornado and the mob is that a tornado, it was made up of air molecules. Yes. And the affordance of air molecules for engaging in cognition in a meaningful way is quite small. Right. Whereas the mob is made up of human beings. And so the affordance of human beings for engaging in cognition is relatively quite high. Yes. And so we may ascribe to the mob a level of cognition that is in fact not properly happening at the mob, but is what happens when something that was alive is now in this parasitic process dynamic, but its subcomponents are in fact fully functioning cognitive agents. And that creates a little bit of a confusion about what's actually going on.
Oh, I see. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Yes. So you're saying there's a great temptation for, we have to be very careful of a category, in a classical sense, a category mistake of misapplying between the species and the genus. Yes.
And if you take the notion of short-term and long-term, or what's it called, global optimum and local optimum, and apply that against the choice-making landscape of a cognitive agent, so let's go with a mobster.
Yeah.
Effectively, what's happening when we refer to the notion of disconnection or separation is we're reducing the scope of self that is actually in the context of making choices. What had been a larger self, a greater being, is now made up of a very field of smaller selves that are making choices on the basis of a much smaller scope of capacity, which is they're oriented towards local optima. Because they're orienting towards local optima, they're in fact degrading the landscape that had included a global optima.
Right.
It's the wholeness of the autopoietic beingness.
Right.
But because these are in fact functional cognitive agents, there's a substantial amount of activity that's going on that looks, in fact, and in fact is cognition, right? So they're shaping the landscape in a potent way.
And then you get those interesting ironies that the good member of the mob has to have virtues. They have to be honest. They have to be trustworthy. They have to be loyal. You have all of these virtues that the mob actually relies upon internally for the mob as itself, as an agent, to be effective in doing this anti-life action out there in the world. And you get sort of this internal external dynamic going on in the mob that you're certainly not going to get in a tornado.
So really looking closely at what's going on inside that gap gives us a lot of insight. In fact, by the way, it may be like a 10,000 year long thermodynamic process that is constantly eating up the feedstock that emerges in the context of ordinary human.
In other words, if you have too much mobness in your population, you're, in a sense, you're eating up your virtues, and because virtues are harder and harder to find, and your entire system is losing energy. This is the same in a country. It's the same in a church. It's the same in an ecclesiastical body. And you can watch this break down in a church once people are no longer listening to each other, once people are no longer forgiving each other, once people no longer have virtue between each other, and then let's say the synod just becomes a, sort of like a mob, and where, well, it's just about me winning as opposed to the whole body. I remember Jordan Peterson, when he was talking about tyranny in one of his classroom lectures, that the tyranny has to go all the way down. And part of the problem you get, and I think you find this in cultures in the world that have tremendous problems with corruption. Now, I know people in America will talk about corruption, but you don't bump into corruption in America the way that you bump into it in many other countries in the world. And this corruption is a huge drag on the system. And this gets into the question of these sort of levels of virtue and levels of goodness.
How humans come together into wholeness, and what is possible in the context of humanness as a source for parasitic process. And every time that source comes together and endeavors to reach a more whole basis, it actually provides a niche for this parasitic process. This goes back to your demons, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. So that if I hear you right, you're proposing that the demonic is actually a case where there's a degradation of the hyperagency into parasitic processing, and we can understand parasitic processing in terms of how it's undermining the cognition of the individual agents. Did I understand you correctly?
Certainly a piece of it, yes.
Well, if I'm missing an important piece, please tell me.
Something along the lines of the, how do we say this? The notion of tornado. So the idea of there being an eddy or a standing wave or a strictly causal dynamic that provides a niche where this degradation process holds the relationship in kind of a medium.
Right.
There's a, how do we say this? This is, I haven't quite got it. Like I can almost feel it, but there's something at the level of the top down that has to, and then the level of the bottom up, and then the relationship It feels like it's all part of the context.
Well, let me try. Maybe something that was missing out of what I just said that I'm now hearing you say is you were talking about like there's something like in right. My point was the egregore is completely bottom up. Right, that's what I was arguing. And then we've got the demonic. And what I heard you saying is the demonic is now a disproportionate relationship between the top down and the bottom up, in which the balance that is found within the hyper agent is being lost because, right, the top down is now in a self-destructive process of undermining the individual cognition of the component people. That's what I heard you saying. Like there's a top down, right? Instead of a balance between the top down and the bottom up, there's a misalignment, and the top down is now imposing and infecting the lower processes.
So the idea would be something like, let's say the system or the hyperagent is trying to be too to fill up too much space. Is not leaving enough, because you need a little messiness on the edge for things to work. And so if they're not careful, it will create it or give the opportunity for give reason for these parasitic processes to kind of appear but I can kind of see it. I can see it mythologically. Sorry, this is my problem. It's like I think in stories. So I can see it mythologically, which is that a good example is, in the Bible, there are these laws about how to till your field. And you till your field, but you have to leave the corner of the field untilled. Mm-hmm. And you have to leave that for the stranger. So you have to leave it for the processes that aren't part of your hyper agent, you could say. You kind of have to leave a little bit of room on the edge for a buffer between. But if you're not careful with those corners, they can start to impose themselves. If you try to till them too much, then they come back like a revenge. They come back like a. And if you leave them too big, then they also they tend to want to eat your system. I don't know if that makes sense. Like you have to be careful because no hyper agent can fill up all of its. Like the world has all this chaos on the edge. So you can't fill up the world with the system. It will always leave a remainder.
So the way that's coming to mind, first of all, what came to mind is Kafka, precisely because what happens in the bureaucracy is it becomes a parasitic process that drains sovereignty and individual cognition away. That's the horror of the Kafkaesque, right? That there's been so bureaucracies are, this is Max Weber, they're supposed to be bottom-up error signal and then top-down prediction, right? Sort of mimicking aspects of, but what happens, right, is you get the bureaucracy just being the top-down discharging of blame and not any upward tick of error correction, and you get the horror, right, because the line of communication has just become unidirectional.
And a bureaucracy that's too strong will produce corruption. It will necessarily produce corruption. That's what happens in a bureaucracy that is too pervasive.
Exactly. And so
and part of that is because the temptation overwhelms the virtue. I mean and that's how the imbalance creates corruption and in fact undermines the virtue in the agents that the entire system relies upon.
What it comes to mind is Karsa's idea, where the hyper agent is oriented towards the infinite game, right? Whereas the parasitic process is engaged in a finite kind of game, because what it's trying to do, right, is get some sort of final closure, right? Because it's I'm sorry, I'm stumbling here. Because it's parasitic, because it's self-destructive, it can't be an infinite game player. Do you get what I'm trying to get at? It can't. Where
this part of the conversation is really good.
It's leaving the corners of the field is that there's going to be stuff beyond the game, and we're going to have to. One of the things we have to do as we play the game is change the rules by how which we play the game, because it'll be the stranger, right? That's the infinite game, right? But the finite game says no. That's the top-down bureaucracy. We can encompass this completely. And when you look at parasitic processing within individuals, what's typically happening is reciprocal narrowing until they get to like, it can't be any other way than this. It can't be any other way than this. Sorry, I'm just trying to like grok what you said, but I got a powerful sense of, right, that there's an inability of parasitic processing the demonic. I mean, but this is, you know,
and this is, you know, he's about to say, I mean, this is why evil can't win. It can't stand on its own. If the more evil wins, the more it disintegrates, degrades, and decays. And life is what goes in the other way.
This, Jonathan, this is like Dionysus. Evil is ultimately totally parasitic on the good, right? It pretends to help its self-existence, but it can't actually play the infinite game.
Right? So but if you think of it like in a person in terms of let's say a fast binge pattern, right? Where someone is on a diet binge pattern, where someone tries to create a top-down pattern of being in themselves, where they're like, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And they make it so strict that the opposite happens, because a parasitic process sets itself up. Then you find yourself at 2 a.m. eating a tub of ice cream, and it's like that is, and you know it's destroying you, but it's like there's something else taking over your will.
Right.
Yeah.
Because what's happens is instead of a dynamic, right, between bottom up and top down, you're getting a vacillation. You get the top down, right, the Kafkaesque, and then you get the bottom up explosion of impulsivity. That's the binging. I lose all agency, and then right, and you're getting that going back, and that's typically what's happening.
I assert will to try to address the vacuum of agency, but that I simply suppress, and then the chaos explodes.
Happening in parasitic processing.
So it comes up for me there, and I'm noticing two things. One is, how do I say this right? Symbolically, I heard John reference the notion of changing the game. Mm-hmm. And so that landed for me was perhaps a orientation or an invitation to shift the game that we're engaging in. And I noticed that I felt something, how do I say, strong perhaps, or a certain clarity when Jonathan was orienting us in the direction of the mythological. So part of the invitation, I would say, is to shift more into a mythological, poetic, artistic, religious, mystic mode. Okay, the other one that came up as I was myself doing that was the word golem came in. Yeah. And it spoke to something like, there's a kind of part in humans, we might call this the mind or the ego, that has as one of its characteristics both a capacity and in some sense a propensity to take itself as the whole. So this is that thing where you don't actually have relationship with proper relationship with wholeness. And I'm wondering if this is that delicate balance of the four-cornered field. The Scylla and Charybdis on either side of that very delicate balance. But actually it takes itself and presents itself as representing the whole, but in fact it certainly can't. And this is what gets you in real trouble. Like that feels like the two sides of the coin. Like one side of the coin is the real actuality of the lived delicate balance of relationship with the actual lived whole. And I'm not sure if this is a commonplace thing. I think it may in fact be a precisely human thing, but we'll see. The challenge or the risk of a particular aspect of human wholes, again, I'll say things like mind and ego, that will endeavor to present themselves as in fact actually being a whole, and therefore get in the way, right? And this is that sort of mob problem, like the demonic capacity, something like that. So there's a bunch of things there that maybe we can play with.
Well, there's definitely, let's say in the image of the demonic hierarchy, you have the devil as pride being the sin of the devil. That is definitely, that is there. The idea is that what the devil says is, I am God, right? I am God. And so comes into conflict with the whole because he wants to be the totality of all things in himself, let's say, and not participate in something.
And of course, this comes through with the Lord of the Rings with Sauron and the Sauron figure.
Something bigger than him. And that is what leads to the two. So in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of the flip between one side and the other, St. Maximus, the confessor, talks about sins of the right hand and sins of the left hand. And he says the first sin is always the sin of the right hand. That is, it's pride, self-sufficiency, all of these types of sins. And then those secretly lead to sins of the left hand, which are passions falling apart, all these thoughts that you can't control, and so you have this movement from one to the other, but it is rooted in the idea of not, let's say, a being not participating in a greater whole, but wanting to just exist as itself, like as this kind of self-perpetuating thing.
So that, I think this is a good move, because participating, like, what's the participatory relationship, right? And so, Levinas makes the famous distinction between totality, which is what the bureaucracy is trying to do, or what the passion is trying to do also, and infinity. Right. And so the totality is the idea that this can be grasped, this can be closed upon, right? Whereas the living thing it has the proper relationship to infinity, in the sense that the living thing has a capacity for evolution that the parasitic processing thing doesn't have, right? Like this is the sense I'm getting, in fact, from Maximus. I'm reading him right now. If I'll use mythological language, as Jordan invited us. If God was to completely remove, he can't, I get it. But if he were, right, and the demons were allowed to run completely free, they would disappear in an instant, right? Because they would reciprocally narrow to nothing. They don't actually, they do not have a capacity. In fact, the defining feature of them, I would put it to you, is they're incapable of evolution. They're incapable of, right, that movement that is constitutive of life, which is the participation in infinity without ever claiming to have a totality. And so the thing I see in the mob is exactly that feature, right? It may be self-perpetuating, and it's
a government that is essentially the mob can never finally level up and become the life-giving thing.
Therefore, it's different than the pure egregore, but it can't evolve. Or I would put it this way: if it starts to evolve, it precisely ceases being a mob and becomes a proper hyper agent.
So
right, and just to hold that little piece right there, is that there's a that thing I brought in earlier about the fact that we don't want to be confused. So the mob, right. We have a very, very nice term, actually. There's a distinction between evolution and development.
Yes.
Development is the exploration of a potential that is already present in a closed domain.
Yes.
So I really liked this point here.
So the mob, in fact, can develop, meaning it has a period of time whereby it can, in fact, expose a novelty that was already imparted into the reality that it was.
The mob can, in a sense, move into gambling and waste management and prostitution and protection. It's exploiting and developing, but it's, as it goes through, it robs. It continues to be parasitic and corrupting, and it robs all of those neighborhoods of it. It basically steals their potential and gives back nothing.
At the moment of its being,
yes,
without actually being connected to a wholeness, and therefore is incapable of.
The addict does the same thing. The addict, well, it takes the bank account of the mother. It lives in the house and eats the food of the father. It continues to take to feed itself, but all of that doesn't act like capital and potential, which in life actually brings greater flourishing. So in a sense, the child who is the addict becomes a black hole into which the entire family is drawn. But the child, which is healthy, then takes all of the resources from the parent and then, in fact, gives and goes. And someday when the parents are old, can bless and take care of the parents. And that even that movement then goes on to bless that the children of the child see what their parent does with the grandparents, and it becomes a growing system.
Evolution, right?
Yes.
Novelty. Yeah. Okay.
Jonathan, doesn't this resonate? I mean, at least in some deep ways. I mean, like I said, I'm doing Lectio Divina on both Dionysius and Maximus right now, and that's right. And I had sections both where they're wrestling with, right, the existence of evil, and they're both making the argument that evil is.
I don't know where John Vervaeke finds the time to do all this stuff.
Kind of pure self-destructiveness, and like Jordan says, it has a capacity
Because he also watches a lot of videos, because he watches some of my videos.
for development, because it's not completely self-existent, although it pretends to be.
Yeah.
Right. But
So,
if it was if it was completely unconstrained by the love of God,
yeah,
it would actually like completely self-destruct. Like, I don't think I'm imposing that on them when I'm saying
no. I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think so. The way that I like to think about it, at least, so would be something like the constitutive elements of an egregore. Let's say they're these parasitic patterns, parasitic structures, but they could have the possibility of being more than what they are. It's just that they aren't. They're self. They're looking at themselves, and it's called a devolving because of that. So an addiction is a good example. So every addiction is based on a true desire, which could lead you into something more. But because it closes itself off and then acts as this weird self-existent being, then it becomes parasitical and tends to destroy the higher agent.
So now we have to bring in the notion of selling your soul. Right?
Yeah.
So the addiction captures the actual vitality of a living being.
Yes.
And it enslaves, it whips, right? It drives that living being. It actually will extinguish it, but in the meantime, it will actually tap into whatever degree of evolution that living being actually still has left in it. So if you imagine sort of your classic, let's go with Jim Morrison, somebody who I have a sort of a connection with, a vital genius connected to wholeness in a particular way, and ridden by a demon that pushed the being into a self-destructive local.
It's interesting, though, that all of this talk about addiction, why you can't just say, well, it's alcohol. No, it's a function of the entire system, because again, someone who it's the rat that's in a box that eats itself to death, but it's not the rat that's in a healthy ecosystem that does that. And so it's, even though we're sort of working on this scientifically, when we sort of isolate something and we're using discrete terms, in the wild, this very much gets into the conversation with Michael Levin and John Vervaeke about the electroceuticals, where it's the network, it's all these stacked up networks within the body that actually produce the wholeness and the life and the vibrancy of the body.
Optima extraction of what was available in terms of a short-term burning brightness that generated an energetic flow of capacity that was extracted by the demon until, of course, the underlying host died, at which point the demon also evaporates, or in this case, has to find a new host.
Find a new host.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop here because I do want to go to that other video.
So that's exactly why I asked Mike the question I asked before, which is, I see what he's doing, and I think also converging with what I'm doing as moving towards, a different kind of ontology, an ontology that can get science and spirituality talking together in a very rigorous, but nevertheless, meaningful fashion.
An ontology that can bridge these gaps. They had a tremendous element of this conversation on placebos. Let's see, the
where each gene turns on and off the other. And so normally what you would do is you would use some sort of dynamical systems theory to say, okay, it has some attractors. This is what it could, these are the states that it could do. And these gene regulatory networks are really critical for building the body in the first place, health and disease, all kinds of pathways back. So typically you would look at this thing and you would say, well, I can see all the interactions. There's no magic here. The agency sort of on the scale of where, of agency of this thing, it's got to be all the way on the left. This thing's just a piece of physics. There's no mind there. So what we did was we said, well, you can't just decide that from an armchair. Let's find out. Let's find out how much of the tools of behavior science actually ports to this thing. because
Nice.
because I was interested in decision making during cellular decision making during development and things like this. And so what we tried were some just really simplistic behaviorist techniques that you would use to train something. I said that my postdoc and I did this. I said pretend I said Pavlov's dog. Right? Pretend this thing is a dog. Just try training it. And what I mean is that to any one pick any one gene and use that as your conditioned stimulus. The other one is your unconditioned stimulus, and pick a third one that's your response. And let's just see what happens. And so what we found is that biological networks, and we looked at like 40 or 50 of these biological networks, they have 6 different kinds of learning that they can do, including associative learning, like Pavlovian conditioning, if you pick the nodes correctly. And so what that means is exactly what you just said. It's an example of that kind of placebo effect, because you can do this. Imagine this: you have one drug that very strongly causes some effect in this network. Okay, that drug targets one node, that's your unconditioned stimulus, and when you apply it, boom, this other thing turns on. Okay, it percolates to the network, this other thing turns on. You've got another drug, that's your neutral stimulus, and it hits a different node, and when you hit that node, nothing happens. It's neutral, it's completely neutral. Well, it turns out that with many of these networks, and by the way, not so much with random networks, which means evolution actually likes this is a biological thing. If you present those two stimuli together some number of times, what will happen in the future is that just giving the neutral drug alone is now sufficient to hit this thing, just like Pavlov's dog. That, to me, that's an example of the placebo effect, because what you're saying to the pharmacologist is, I can train this tissue so that you are going to give it a completely inert sugar pill, and it's going to act as if you just gave it one of your most potent drugs. And the reason you might want to do that is because some of those potent drugs are actually too strong to be used in humans.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So you could. So I think you're right on the money. If the gene regulatory networks can have placebo effect, I mean, it only stands to reason it will scale up with. Right. And I'm very. Have you? I'm sure you're probably more familiar than I with this, but have you seen like Albert Mason stuff on psycho-dermatology? Okay, you should. I'll remind me afterwards. I'll send you like this. This is amazing. So this guy, and unfortunately he passed away. I tried to send him an email and I found out he already passed. He was a hypnotist that basically he was delivering babies, and he didn't like using anesthetics because he felt that it would impact and so he decided to use hypnosis. So he was in the UK. He started doing delivery.
And so what this goes to is okay. So we have all these electrical networks. And then there's the reality that I'm moving my hand because of an electrical network. And all of these electrical networks are together, but they're sort of firewalled from each other in the way that, you can type anything into your computer, but let's say anything into a notepad document, but that's not going to crash Windows. So there are walls and things built in, but there are also gateways. And I mean, this is just a fascinating thing.
Of babies under hypnosis, no anesthesia. His fellow doctors sort of made fun of him and said, well, if hypnosis is so great here, and they gave him a kid with some sort of horrible skin disease on both arms. So, his skin was basically black. He was missing some kind of one of the important skin cells he was missing. So he found out, and then for decades he ran this practice of hypno-dermatology, whereby giving suggestions he could clear up certain kinds of skin disorders. Now, this is very important, as you said, going across levels, right? Because you're communicating on a very high level with language. You're saying, your left arm, and in fact, he did that. He started by clearing one arm, not the other. So which is just amazing. And so right, and so, but that somehow filters down into the molecular signals that it needs that the skin cells need to do whatever. So it's crossing multiple levels. And then the amazing thing at the end of his so this is a set of lectures that he gave like an interview. At the end, he said he left his practice and he became a psychiatrist and doing counseling, because what he realized was that dealing with problems at that level, what would happen is the specific symptoms would clear up as they should, but it would pop up somewhere else. So he was noticing that his patients, right? So yeah, their skin cleared up, but now
and you have this all the time. It's interesting with alcoholics that I've known. They stop drinking and then they start eating. And it's like almost the malady moves, and now eating is a slower drug, but it'll kill you as much as drinking if you eat too much or you don't eat well. And so you've got all of these systems that are in fact connected within us. And again, back to the body of the dysfunctional family, and then the Synod and the advisory committee, they're all networked too. And we're using language and just many tiny subtle communications of personality, and deeply nested in this astoundingly complex system.
They started smoking, or they had to get a divorce because they were too whatever. So so he tried to climb to an even higher level and say, let's see if we can resolve this on some sort of psychological level. But I think what you identified is one of the most important things for medicine for the next century is understanding that cross-level connections and saying.
And this also, of course, has to do with addiction. That someone whose life is generally healthy, well, they can drink. It's not a problem. And a lot of these other, they might stop by a casino. It's not a problem. Their life, they're sort of resistant. But if there's dysfunction, then in a sense that demon grabs onto you and moves in, and instead of, like, let's say the mob, just begins to not only eat like a parasite all of the surrounding things, take over all the stored up potential left by years of virtue, but continue then to just eat itself and to just continue to devolve.
What is it that what is the interface to these cells? And apparently your brain and your ability to comprehend eventually filters down to control that to some mechanisms that can control the cells. And just as a last thing, we shouldn't be terribly surprised about this. I realized just recently, if you say to someone, I can voluntarily change the resting potential of 30% of my body cells. Let's say you're crazy. You can't voluntarily control your resting potential. Well, how do you get up out of bed in the morning? That's exactly what you're doing. You're voluntarily changing the bioelectrical properties of your muscle cells. That's what you're doing. You actually do have bioelectric control over some of your body cells, and maybe many of your body cells that you don't necessarily use or know about.
And you can download from the internet and run a special program to update the firmware on your computer. Normally those things are segmented, but you download updates. Let's say in Windows, you get that little blue screen in 30, 60, 80. So there are gateways down to different levels.
And so, yes.
But the really interesting thing is not only are there gateways down to different levels, there's gateways out to each other in these larger bodies that go.
So using therapy, hypnosis, whatever it's going to be, as an interface to that low-level cellular system it's got to be the future of medicine. I'm sure of it. Trying to micromanage it with drugs is temporary, I think.
Can I jump?
Now I've got to find something that Levin says, because he just put it right into a phrase.
Basically, to me, that question of control at a higher level is not any less real or less valuable. In fact, it's probably much more powerful than trying to micromanage it from the bottom up with drugs and so on. So I think down the line, that understanding of it, which now we're sort of just see it as placebo. I think it's a whole constellation of interesting sort of proto-cognitive features of our body organs and tissues and so on. That's going to be the main act, and the molecular and kind of the molecular stuff eventually is going to be the minor part of it, and the rest of it is going to be the major part. I have to apologize. In about 4 minutes, I mean, this hour has gone by incredibly fast. I can't believe it's been an hour, and I'm gonna have to go at 5 because I have another meeting I can't get out of. But we should if you're willing, we should do this again and keep going, because
I'm
so much interesting stuff.
I found this fascinating and thrilling, Mike. I'm so
likewise
so
super interesting.
Yeah, so grateful, Karen, that you put us together.
Exactly.
So far, I've only asked one question. So we could do this many more times, but I'm just glad it worked out. And thank you for letting me know that you've got this thing coming up, Mike. So we have 4 minutes left. Anything you want to say to wrap up before Mike goes, or?
Me?
Any question you have for him, John, that he could answer?
Well, I've got more, but I think they would not be answerable in 4 minutes. Instead, just remind Mike.
Hypno-dermatology.
Yes, Eric Hole's work. Yeah. in our center a few years ago. It just
that is so
surface of I have so many things I want to hear your take on. So we'll do this again.
So he just basically noted that. I mean, we're anyway. Can't remember exactly how he said it. I'll listen to it again and then I'll find it. Now I want to connect it with the end of this conversation, and Jonathan just, I thought, really brought out some of the best in Jordan in this. Jonathan didn't talk that much, but, you know, given the context, it's totally understandable. People had just paid a lot of money to hear Jordan talk. But Jonathan asked just the right questions, and I think contributed just amount to this was one of my favorite Jordan Peterson presentations. It was really, really good. And this section here, so we talked about Vervaeke, we had Vervaeke and Hall and Jonathan, and we're talking about life and sort of this system that goes, and the proper balance between emanation and emergence, and this dynamic things. But it gets into this question of, well, how and where, and how do we know, and where do we go, and what does it look like? And I think this is what Jordan really put his finger on here in this segment.
The solution to that will be that the Superman will have to appear, the Übermensch, and he will be the man who can create his own values. And so both Freud and Jung were interested in that idea. Freud more peripherally, but Jung more consciously. And part of what Jung was trying to find out is, well, could we create our own values? And the answer he came up with was, no, that's not possible. And why? So the question is why? Well, you know, for the psychoanalysts, we were beset by fantasies, and these are sort of autonomous personalities that dwell in our subconscious, let's say, in our imagination, in our dreams, and that possess us from time to time.
So with the initial conversation with Pageau and Vervaeke and Jordan Hall, we're sort of dealing with us up. These distributed cognition, these hyper agents, these bodies, these spirits. Now we're going down, and sort of in the middle with Levin and Vervaeke, we sort of had the middle. You know, can we and ourselves, what does it mean to be healthy and whole, and to have, you know, all of our internal electrical networks connecting up with the other networks? And now we're just going to sort of go all the way down and bring it all the way up and out.
Time, the spirit of rage, the spirit of lust, the spirit of envy, these ancient gods that possess us, and these values and temptations and impulses that come upon us that we cannot control. They're part of our autonomous nature. And because they have this autonomy, and so that would be the autonomy of emotions and the autonomy of motivations, and then even the autonomy of the spirit that unites motivations, because we don't know, for example, in the spirit of play, for example, play is an instinct. Play integrates base motivations into a higher unity, but it's an instinct. And so Jung realized very rapidly that it wasn't technically possible for us to create our own values. And that's partly his stumbling upon the problem of complexity. So the world's just too complex for us to generate our values in the span of a single life, out of whole cloth, autonomously, no matter how much of a Superman we were.
Yeah.
And then partly the reason that's impossible is, well, okay, so generate your own values. What the hell are you going to do with your wife or your husband?
Okay, so where do the values come from? And what's interesting is that a lot of the science stuff, and I mean, Peterson's trying to put it together. Where does life come from? I mean, it seems to come from above. And when the top and the bottom, when the upper and lower register are meet, when from below and from above it comes together, you know, the man, God takes and forms a man out of the dust of the earth and breathes into him, and he becomes a living nephesh.
Or your friend, they're just gonna live by your values all of a sudden? Well, that's what the postmodernists are demanding now. The radical types, it's like, my game, right? My identity. I'm whatever I say I am, moment to moment. And there's no negotiation. And that's because they're 2 years old. And I mean that. I mean that technically. I mean, one of the things I learned partly from reading Freud had this idea of developmental fixation, and he noticed in his clients, in his patients, that people would get stuck at a developmental level. And so you'd be talking to an adult and all of a sudden they were 4 years old. And I learned to see that in my clients and, well, in people I talk to, I'll do that with if they're annoying me. You know, like, okay, who the hell are you? Oh, I see. You're a 13-year-old mean girl. Okay, away we go. I know who I'm talking to now. And these solipsistic identity totalitarians are 2 years old. And 2-year-olds are very governed by emotion. They're completely incapable of negotiation. They're egotistical in that their worldview dominates. They have no notion whatsoever of...
And so here, going all the way back to the first conversation, they're 2 years old. Well, a 2-year-old is fine as a 2-year-old because they're going to grow and develop and go that way. But if you're stuck in a 2-year-old developmental level and you're an adult, well, now suddenly life isn't going to happen around you. And where I love where he goes with this is that this life, this whole, this center then moves and goes around you, and life begets life.
Of negotiated play, and their belief is their identity is 100% generated by them, dependent on what they feel moment to moment.
It's the secret sacred self. It's sort of a Gnostic self down that, and this self has to be asserted.
Is exactly how a 2-year-old operates, and most of them get socialized out of that by the age of 4, and those that don't have a very dismal time of it after that. So, and I think we have a lot of people like that now because screens have interfered with pretend play and negotiation, and because Oedipal parents and social systems have enabled a kind of immature narcissism that makes itself manifest in these absurd claims about identity. And that's all part of creating your own values. I can be whatever sex I want to be moment to moment. It's like, well, fine, but how are other people supposed to deal with that? Because they don't know what to do. Well, it doesn't matter. They have to do exactly what I want them to. It's like, hey, good luck with that. You Superman, you Ubermensch with your own values. And this is also partly why the small L liberal types are wrong in a fundamental sense. And this would include most therapists, is like, you might think of identity and of sanity itself as sort of an internal psychological arrangement, you know, so you have your act together, it's sort of in your brain. Or
it's you know, now we're getting connected back to the Michael Levin thing, that sanity as well as it internal. Well, yes, as is health, but health is always relational on the outside. And it's, I had this one professor of ethics at seminary, and he said it so often, it's giving and receiving, and it's giving and receiving. It was an interesting guy. It was a delightful guy.
In your psyche, and you're sane, and there's insane people around you, but you're sane. It's like, that isn't really right. It's sort of right, but, you know, you're sane if you're a reciprocal partner in your marriage. You're sane if you have 3 or 4 friendships that you've been able to maintain, because you can act reciprocally. And the sanity is actually the balance between you and your wife or husband, and then you and your wife or husband and your friends, or you and your wife and your husband, or your husband and your children and your friends and your larger family. It's this nested thing that we already talked about. It's like, you can't be sane in the absence of that, because that's actually the definition of sanity. And it's collective as well, as that's why the kingdom of God is within you and without you. It's exactly that. It's like, yeah, you have a harmonious psyche, but, you know, are you dancing with yourself to music that no one else can hear? That's not helpful. There's a communal element of it that has to be in place. And so if you're sane, your marriage is sane, and you have sane relationships with your children, you have sane relationships with your friends, and you're a good employee or a boss. And
this is social. What do we call it? We call it social life, and it begets and it multiplies and it grows.
You're a participant in the civic world, and all of that is embedded in this hierarchy that has the spirit at the top that enables that reciprocity to operate. And you're a devotee of that, or you're not, right? And so, and that's the religious domain.
And you have to actively celebrate at the different levels.
And this is one thing that Jonathan brought in earlier, but the celebration. Well, what is the celebration? The celebration is what do you do when you celebrate? We spend a lot of money. Well, why do you spend a lot of money when you celebrate? Because in a sense, you're spending a lot of money on the social, on the party. Luke 15, the prodigal son is grabbed back by the father and says, I'm not letting you go. We're going to kill the fatted calf. We're going to celebrate. And of course, the older brother is bitter about that. I've slaved for you all of these years, and you've never given me so much of a goat. No, you don't understand. The celebration is the flower of life, which is, of course, the flower is the sexual organ of the plant, and it engages socially to attract the bee, and then the bee comes and pollinates, and it goes and goes and goes. And this is, on one hand, is the flowering of life, but it's also the net that we depend on for life, for our food, for our ecosystem, for our joy, for all of this.
That you participate in that, and
Yeah.
I think that's where I kind of bring it back to helping people understand, like, why do people go to church, right? Because that's what's going
Well,
on.
and why should they?
Right.
Because that's a discussion. So Jonathan took me to an Orthodox ceremony in Seattle, and like, I wasn't into it. I found it grated on me.
You're like a 10-year-old boy that we're telling to stop moving.
Yeah,
Stop,
that's right.
stop,
So that was my Freudian fixations. Like, yeah, you're 10.
Stop wiggling.
Yeah, stop wiggling. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. But, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, man. And I went to an Orthodox mass here a couple of weeks ago, and I found it and a Catholic one a week before that. I was down at Franciscan University, and I found it unbelievably soothing, which was very much unlike the reactions I've had before. And that was partly, well, for complicated reasons, because I actually find any place that isn't a bloody nightmarish catastrophe soothing now. And so
he's sensitive to life, and what he is sensitive to death. And because he's tasted death and been so close to death and has been robbed of so much life, I think he's very sensitive, and that's drawing him.
I mean that, man. But there was more to it than that, too. It was because I also did develop, and partly as a consequence of our discussions, a deeper appreciation for what was happening in the ritual itself, and also more tolerance for whatever inadequacies I might perceive, And partly that's also realization. Lots of modern people say, well, I don't go to church because I don't believe that. It's like, well, who cares what you believe? Like, who the hell are you anyways? Like, and why do you even care what you believe? And how's that working for you, this belief set that you theoretically have? And so how sophisticated is that? Like, are you Plato or what? It's like, well, here's the church and here's me and I'm right. It's like, well, no, you're not. And first, and second, you don't even want to be, because that's a great place to be, like pinnacle of brilliant wisdom. It's completely solipsistic. No tradition for me, thank you very much. I've got it all right in my head. And even if you are right that the bloody institution is chaotic and
now there's confession in this, because the reason he knows it well is because he has been this.
And decadent in some fundamental sense. It's like, well, good, there's something for you to do, like there always has been throughout the entire history of mankind, because that's Osiris, right? The once great king who's fallen into disrepair. It's like, well, if the church is broken and you're the genius to see it, why don't you go fix it? Well, then you might say, well, we'll just abandon it. It's like, okay, well, fine. You're going to get rid of that, You're going to get rid of marriage. You're going to get rid of funerals. You're going to get rid of Christmas. You're going to get rid of any sense of sacred time. You're going to dispense with the whole history of what Judeo-Christian thought. You're going to dispense with the idea of the sacred nature of the individual. Like, how far are you willing to go with this?
And then it's back to, you're going to build this all up in your own lifetime? You're going to be the center of it? You're going to be the totality of it? Again, back to the first conversation. And no, you can't. That's not who you are. You've been put into the world by the flower of previous generations and the celebrations, and basically, if you imagine that you are the center of it, or the totality of it, or the telos of it, that you yourself are the telos, well, then it will end with you. So, yeah, amazing videos that came out while in this last week or so, and just what I've played for you is just the tip of the iceberg, and it sort of comes together into my thinking of, okay, how do we behave as a group? How do we bring life? What is the church for? How does the church have to process this thing? What is the body? Does it have agency? All of these issues come together. Well, I'm out of time, but I hope you enjoy this video. Leave a comment.